This portion is called Mishpatim, which means ordinances or laws, and it covers 4 chapters, chapter 21, 22, 23, and 24. At the end of this portion, Moses is commanded to ascend the mountain, Mount Sinai, and receive the stone tablets with the 10 commandments, and be taught the Mishpatim, the laws and ordinances that were to govern Israel, a full 613 of them. Paul said to the Galatians in the New Testament, if they were keen on submitting to just one of the laws, they must submit to the other 612. It's grace through Christ and nothing else, or the entirety of the law. You can't have a bit of both. It's one or the other. But back to Moses at the Mount. This clearly wasn't going to be a holiday. In fact, it was nothing short of a miracle that Moses was able to comprehend all this information. Moses supplied the willingness and God provided the miracle. It's always that way. But it would still take everything that Moses possessed. And this is indicated in a very interesting expression used by God, as though to warn Moses that although the transmission would be miraculous, it depended on Moses' full cooperation, nothing less. Chapter 30, 24, verse 12, God says this, "Come up to me into the mount and be there." Now God could simply have said, "Come up to me into the mount," but he adds, "and be there." God knows us human beings profoundly. He knows our habit of being in 2 or more places at once. We often say, "Oh, sorry, my mind was elsewhere. Could you repeat that, please?" The story is told of a man at a prayer meeting whose mind wasn't focused on the matter of prayer. He was at the meeting bodily, but he wasn't really there. At the end of the meeting, the man stood up brightly, and the pastor went over to him with a knowing look on his face and said, "Welcome to the meeting." I think we've all been in that position, especially if the subject is either boring or else calls for a lot of concentration. I've often been there. I imagine God calling to Moses from the cloud, "Come up to me in the mount," and then a pause, "and be there." He said it in love, of course. He knows what we're like. I had a friend who was a teacher, and he would occasionally intersperse what he was saying in the classroom with something unrelated to the subject, like, "Wordsworth wrote much of his poetry in the Lake District, and glass is made from sand." And if there was no reaction, he knew nobody was listening. And so he made it a rule that he would always say something out of place during the lesson, and they were to look out for it. You could imagine how that improved their concentration. I was convicted one day about how disrespectful it was to not pay full attention when somebody's talking to me. I then imagined how embarrassed I'd be if they could see into my mind, see that bubble above my head with my thoughts written in it. So I started pretending that they could see into my mind, and that made me behave myself. Well, that's a pretty silly thing to do, probably. But it did work. I think the modern devices of mobile phones, headphones, constant background music and so on have only made this problem all the worse. Another world, you see, is constantly eavesdropping on this one, and people are living half in this one and half in that one instead of being here and now. I think the military call it AWOL, AWOL, and it stands for absent without leave. God was warning Moses not to be AWOL. The desire to be somewhere else and in some other time. To adapt the words of Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French philosopher and Christian, quote, "So foolhardy are we that we go wandering about in periods of time and in other places which do not belong to us, and give no thought to the only one that does, the here and now." Unquote. Beautiful words, poetic, philosophic, and true. Psalm 46 says, God is a very present help in trouble. He's very present here and now. Thank goodness God knows how to be here and now. He's never been distracted and never shall be. 1 million people can be praying at any given time, and God gives each one 100% attention. In this world, that's impossible. But in the world of the infinite, it's quite normal. Peter even referred to the now God of all grace. That's the literal translation of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10, the now God of all grace, not the past God of all grace, nor the future God of all grace, but the now God of all grace. In these last days, there is an increase of nostalgia because the present is unpleasant and people long to live in a world more romantic and less complicated. Well, this desire is understandable, but it's unhealthy. And it's also the cause of drug and alcohol abuse, the longing to escape. Meanwhile, the so-called elite, whose only advantages are wealth and arrogance, are trying to manipulate a future in which they will own everything, having reduced the world population by 95%. So they hope. But God is in charge. We Christians do not long for the past, neither do we fear the future. If we do find ourselves thinking that way because of our human weakness, we check ourselves. And we avoid nostalgia in music, literature, and films. Whatever stirs those gloomy thoughts that Wordsworth described as, quote, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. That's unhealthy. That's not right. It makes for beautiful poetry, all right, but it's an ugly habit of life. It's ugly and it's corrosive. The whole business, you see, revolves around self-pity. Christians have nothing to do with nostalgia, for longing to be in some distant Avalon somewhere or some distant past of their own where it was always sunny and always wonderful. It's good to have sweet and good memories, but we are in the here and now, and God is the God of now. Hallelujah. And as for the future, whilst we look forward to the return of Jesus, to the rapture, the kingdom, we don't let it affect our ability to live fully in the here and now and to give everything we have to now. We don't allow past or future to rob us of the present, because that's the place that God said, be there. The battle for the here and now is on. Occupy it until he returns.